Hello, this is the Death Row and Executions channel with a real voice narrating, as you can see. My name is Paco Rivera, and you can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more Death Row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel, The Maximum Sentence, where I cover a recent crime and conviction. There will also be a link for that. Today, I'm going to talk about a triple murder that happened in South Memphis, Tennessee in the year 1994, 32 years ago. What is very disturbing about this case is how the three victims were killed. Two men were shot, but the wounds were not fatal. A woman was strangled, but that didn't kill her. What ultimately killed them was having been placed inside a grave at Rose Hill Cemetery in Memphis, a grave that was prepared for a dearly departed of another family attending a funeral with the burial to take place on the following day. And all three of them were buried while still alive. One of the victims who was killed in this case was a drug dealer. So, of course, many of you are probably not going to have a lot of sympathy about his death. Also killed was his mother and a teenage friend of the drug dealer who was not involved in drugs. The drug dealer was Marcellos Anderson. He was 21 years old and described as someone who always wore a lot of expensive jewelry, including a large diamond ring, and he always carried large amounts of cash. He also had stashed in his house, where he lived with his mother, up in the attic, a very large amount of cash. Another victim in this case was the drug dealer's mother, Delois Anderson, who was 43 years old. The third victim was a friend of the drug dealer, Marcellos Anderson, who was only 17 years old, a young man named Frederick Tucker. According to reports, there is no indication that the mother, Delois, or the friend, Frederick, who, like I said, were in any way involved in the drug trade business that Marcellos was operating. By the way, as I said, Marcellos was living with his mother, Delois, but there was also another woman living there in the home named Laventhia Briggs. Laventhia is referred to in the case files as Delois's niece, which tells me that she is also Marcellos's cousin. Anyway, I will talk a bit more about Laventhia later because she is the woman who reported her aunt Delois and her cousin Marcellos missing to police. This case was a little more complicated than most others I've presented, mostly because of so many different events that took place before the triple murder occurred, and because there were so many people involved. So I tried to simplify this presentation by putting together a simple timeline and only mentioning the names of the main people involved. There are also a lot of crazy situations with this case, so you will probably hear me use that word crazy a lot, a few times at least during this presentation.
Well, it was pretty gruesome, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, but I wasn't there.
That was Tony Carruthers, who is scheduled to be executed in Tennessee this year on May 21st. Of course, yet another death row inmate who said he didn't do it, that he wasn't there. To jump ahead for a moment, because there was no actual physical evidence linking Carruthers to the triple murder, his excuse is that it was a lot of other people's mouths that got him convicted. Yes, it is true that we can't trust what comes out of the mouths of convicted felons that have turned into jailhouse snitches, jailhouse informants. Most of them are looking for favors and trying to get out of jail sooner, so they will lie. But there was testimony from quite a few others whom were not criminals. And Tony Carruthers wants you to believe that he was the only one at trial telling the truth and everybody else was lying. But the more I researched this case, the more it seemed to me that it was mostly what came out of the mouth of Tony Carruthers himself that got him convicted. The disappearance of Marcellos, Delois, and Frederick happened on February 24th, 1994. They were reported missing on the following day, and they were found buried inside a grave in a cemetery a week later, on March 3rd, 1994. But this story begins about 5 months earlier, in September of 1993, when this man, Tony Carruthers, was doing time in prison and had written some letters where he discussed a, quote, master plan to take over the streets in Memphis when he gets out of prison. Later that year of 1993, Carruthers was doing time at the Mark Luttrell Reception Center in Memphis, and he was assigned a work detail at the West Tennessee Veterans Cemetery and had even assisted with the burial of the deceased. While there, an inmate working with Carruthers, a man named Charles Ray Smith, stated that Carruthers had told him that would be a good way to get rid of someone you kill, with Carruthers saying, "If you ain't got no body, you ain't got no case." That same inmate, Charles Ray Smith, also said that while in jail, he overheard a conversation between Tony Carruthers and another inmate named James Montgomery, where they were making plans to kidnap, rob, and kill a drug dealer named Marcellos Anderson when they got out. As it turns out, Tony Carruthers and Marcellos Anderson were acquainted with each other. As a matter of fact, when Carruthers was released in November of 1993, it was Marcellos Anderson who went to the jail to pick him up, and they later went to gather with other friends. Charles Ray Smith was released a month later. Only Carruthers' partner, James Montgomery, remained in jail a bit longer. When Charles Smith got out, he went to see Marcellos Anderson to warn him, "Hey, just so you know, I heard Tony Carruthers and James Montgomery talking while we were all locked up, and they were planning to take you out and take your money and drugs when James gets out of jail." But for some reason, Marcellos didn't take the warning seriously. Reports say that he trusted Tony Carruthers. Well, James Montgomery was released in January 1994, and a little over a month later, Marcellos Anderson had borrowed a white Jeep Cherokee from a cousin named Michael Harris. It was now February 24th, 1994, the day of the triple murder. Several witnesses would later say that Marcellos was driving around in the white Jeep with a 17-year-old friend named Frederick Tucker about 4:30 in the afternoon. Now, also in the white Jeep was James Montgomery and James's brother, Jonathan Montgomery. Remember, James Montgomery was planning the kidnapping, robbery, and murder of the drug dealer Marcellos Anderson with Tony Carruthers. But Carruthers wasn't riding around in the Jeep with them that day. Not yet, anyway, or he wasn't seen in the vehicle. All four men then went to the home of a cousin of the Montgomery brothers, a woman named Nikita, who lived with her 4 children and a cousin. Nikita would later tell police, and also later testify at trial, that her 2 cousins, James and Jonathan Montgomery, arrived at her house with 2 men she knew as Marcellos Anderson and a young man named Frederick Tucker. She did not see Tony Carruthers at that time. She said that they all went down into the basement and that a short time later, her cousin, James Montgomery, came up to her and told her to get her 4 kids and her cousin and to get out of the house for a while because something really bad was going to happen there. According to Nikita, when Nikita's cousin, who lived with her, asked her what was going on, she said, "It looks like they are kidnapping Marcellos and the young guy, Frederick Tucker." So Nikita and her 4 kids and the cousin left, and they returned a few hours later. Nikita told police and later testified that when she returned to the house, she first saw her cousin James Montgomery, who was now with Tony Carruthers. So now Tony Carruthers was also at the house, and James told her that they weren't done yet. So to take all her kids up to the bedroom and don't come out until they leave. Nikita told police that when they all left, she looked outside and saw her cousin James Montgomery and Tony Carruthers leading Marcellos Anderson and Frederick Tucker to the white Jeep Cherokee that Marcellos was driving, and they all got inside. And get this, she told police that it looked to her like Marcellos and Frederick both had their hands tied behind their back. However, when it came time to testify in court at the trial of Tony Carruthers and James Montgomery 2 years later, she retracted that statement that she had originally made to police. She was now testifying that she was wrong, that she did not see their hands tied behind their back. Remember, James Montgomery is her cousin, so it appears that she was now in protect my family mode when testifying. Back to the night of February 24th. Because Marcello's mother, Delois Anderson, disappeared sometime later, it would seem from the timeline that Tony Carruthers and James Montgomery drove the Jeep to the home of Marcellos Anderson, and once inside, Carruthers and Montgomery proceeded to rob the home of cash and drugs. According to the niece of Delois Anderson, Laventhia Briggs, who also lived in the house, she said that she was out that night and that at about 8 o'clock she called the house. Laventhia says that someone picked up the phone but did not speak. Whoever answered didn't say anything. So Laventhia is there saying hello, hello, but nobody is talking. So she hung up. She tried calling a few more times, but now nobody was answering the phone. Laventhia says that when she got home at about 9 o'clock that night, and when she went into her Aunt Delois's bedroom, she saw a meal that was just partially eaten. Most of it was still there, as if Delois was having a meal and was interrupted by something or someone and then left the house. It surely appeared very strange to her. What we know happened that night is that Marcellos Anderson, his mother Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker were all taken somewhere, where Marcellos was shot in the neck, the bullet piercing his neck and striking his spine. The medical examiner that did the autopsy said that he would have been paralyzed at that point, but could have survived with medical attention. So the gunshots is not what killed him. 17-year-old Frederick Tucker was also shot several times, and while none of his wounds also were not fatal, he was severely disabled. So the gunshots is not what killed him. When Delois's body was found, she had a long red sock wrapped around her neck. So it appears there was an attempt to strangle Delois, but that is not what killed her. Now, here is where things get crazy. They were all at the Rose Hill Cemetery on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis. There was a grave there that was prepared for a recently departed woman named Dorothy Daniels. Now, to get an understanding of that gravesite, according to a cemetery employee that was questioned, the grave was dug the day before, and what is referred to as a pressed wood box or a vault is inserted into the grave. The coffin, when it arrives at the grave for the burial, is placed inside the wood box or vault, which I believe is enclosed to protect the coffin, and then the grave is filled with dirt. That cemetery employee said that it would have taken at least 2 people to remove that vault from the grave. Underneath that vault, inside the grave, was a 2-foot-high pit, an opening just large enough to stack 3 bodies. So Marcellos Anderson, his mother Delois Anderson, and Marcellos' friend Frederick Tucker were dropped into that pit and stacked together and then that heavy vault was placed on top of them. All three of them still alive, but too disabled or unconscious to do anything about it. Jumping ahead for a moment, a medical examiner stated that the pressure from that vault on top of all three victims, combined with the shotgun wounds that they had sustained and breathing in dirt, is what ultimately caused their deaths. On the following day, following the funeral services for Dorothy Daniels, who was lying in her coffin, that coffin was lowered into the vault in the grave, surely with friends and family gathered and possibly a minister delivering a message about the dearly departed's soul in the coffin. And then the grave later was filled with nobody suspecting that there were 3 additional dead bodies lying underneath Dorothy Daniels. This has got to be one of the craziest stories I have ever done since I began doing these presentations. 3 dead bodies underneath a dead body in a coffin in a cemetery grave. That is definitely a first for me. Let's go back a few hours to just after the 3 victims were shot and strangled and thrown down into the grave. James Montgomery's brother, Jonathan Montgomery, called a childhood friend of his named Chris Hines. Chris Hines would later testify that Jonathan had called him about 8:45 that night and that he was all excited and saying that they had just scored $200,000. It is believed that that is in fact about how much money the drug dealer Marcellos Anderson had hidden in the attic of his mother's house. Jonathan also told his friend Chris Hines that they took care of Marcellos and others. Hines said that Jonathan arrived at his house at about 9 o'clock that night, and according to Hines, Jonathan had then said, "Man, we got them folks out at the cemetery on Elvis Presley," and he repeated, "We got $200,000. He then said that he needed Hines to drive him to the cemetery, but Hines didn't want to get involved, and instead he loaned his car to Jonathan Montgomery. At about 2:40 in the morning, the Jeep Cherokee that Marcellos had borrowed from his cousin Michael Harris was found in the state of Mississippi, completely destroyed by fire. Sometime around 3:30 in the morning, investigators from Mississippi had already determined that the owner of the vehicle was a Michael Harris in Memphis, Tennessee, and they called him about 3:30 in the morning to let him know, "Hey, just so you know, your car was found burned up in a fire here in Mississippi." So Michael Harris called Marcellos Anderson's mom, Delois Anderson, to find out what happened after he had loaned his Jeep to her son. But it was Laventhia Briggs who answered the call. And now she believes definitely something is terribly wrong, because neither her Aunt Delois or the son Marcellos ever came back home. So she notified police to report them missing and to let them know that the car that Marcellos was driving was found on fire in Mississippi. Investigators began their investigation and eventually learned of all of the last people to have been seen by witnesses with Marcellos. And one of those people that witnesses saw and who police questioned was Jonathan Montgomery. Investigators said that Jonathan Montgomery appeared to be very deceptive with his answers, his responses to questions, and he was very inconsistent. He kept changing his stories, and that made them very suspicious that, hey, this guy must be involved. And after he was pressed harder, he agreed to lead investigators to the gravesite at Rose Hill Cemetery on Elvis Presley Boulevard. This was now March 3rd, 1994, 7 days after the 3 victims went missing. The grave was dug out. The coffin of Dorothy Daniels was removed, along with the vault that held the coffin, and 3 bodies were found underneath in the pit. The medical examiner reported that there was dirt deep in their noses and mouth and airways, meaning that they had breathed in dirt and were still alive when they were buried. Just to be sure, investigators also checked the contents of the coffin that held Dorothy Daniels and determined that it was not disturbed. In other words, her coffin most likely was never opened after being placed in the grave the following day. Chris Hines would tell police and later testify that the car that Jonathan Montgomery had borrowed from him was returned to him about 8:30 in the morning, following the night that the 3 victims had disappeared. Inside the car, according to Chris Hines, was James Montgomery, Jonathan Montgomery, and yes, Tony Carruthers. He said the car was returned very muddy and dirty. So, based on this timeline, it seems that Jonathan had used the car that he borrowed from Chris Hines to follow the white Jeep into the state of Mississippi, where they set the Jeep on fire, and then Jonathan drove back with his brother James and Tony Carruthers to return the car. Shortly after the discoveries of the 3 bodies in the grave, all 3 men, Tony Carruthers and the Montgomery brothers, James and Jonathan, were arrested and charged with the triple murder. It took about 2 years for the case against the 3 men to go to trial in 1996. However, shortly before the start of the trial, Jonathan Montgomery was found dead in his cell after he had hung himself. So now only 2 men would be on trial, and they would be on trial together. There were many delays leading to the trial because Tony Carruthers kept getting rid of the lawyer that was appointed to him, and he did that 6 times. Some of the lawyers had to withdraw from the case because Carruthers was threatening to kill their family members if the lawyer doesn't get the case dropped. The judge became so frustrated that he gave Carruthers the option of having one last lawyer assigned to him, or he can represent himself as his own lawyer, and Carruthers chose to represent himself.
I've tried over and over and over to get lawyers in here for you, and over and over and over, you have succeeded in threatening them, running them away.
In the end, both Tony Carruthers and James Montgomery were found guilty, and both were sentenced to death. However, jumping ahead for a minute, following a successful appeal, James Montgomery later pleaded guilty to lesser charges, and he was sentenced in the year 2006 to 27 years in prison for second-degree murder. He was released in the year 2015 with time served and is currently a free man. The appeal by James Montgomery was based on how he and Carruthers should not have been tried together, because Carruthers had a long record of being a convicted felon previously, and that was used at the trial, and that would have prejudiced the jury against Montgomery, who did not have a long criminal record. The court agreed and overturned the conviction, but instead of going to trial again, prosecutors negotiated a plea agreement with James Montgomery that turned out to be very beneficial to him, whereby a death sentence had instead become him doing time for 20 years before he was eventually released. Tony Carruthers has tried to maintain his innocence, and still does, to the end, and ultimately remains on death row and is scheduled to be executed in Tennessee on May 21st of this year.
I'm not going to be executed, Mrs. Roach. And I'm smiling, I'm happy, because I'm going to be exonerated.
Now, just a bit more craziness. A lot has been said in the media regarding this case about this man. His name is Alfredo Shaw. Supporters of Tony Carruthers want people to believe that it was the sole testimony of this man that got Tony Carruthers sentenced to death. Alfredo Shaw was a convicted felon with a lot of legal troubles when he had seen news about the case and one day decided to call police to tell them that he was incarcerated at the jail where Tony Carruthers was being held and that Carruthers had confessed everything about the crime to him. According to Alfredo Shaw, Carruthers had told him that he went with James and Jonathan Montgomery to the home of Marcellos Anderson. But Marcellos wasn't there. Only his mother, Delois, was home. So Carruthers told Delois to call her son and tell him to come home now, that it was very important. When Marcellos arrived at the house with the young man, Frederick Tucker, all three, Marcellos, Frederick, and Delois, were tied up and placed in the Jeep and driven to the state of Mississippi, where all three were shot and killed. Carruthers and his accomplices then set the Jeep on fire, and they had used a stolen car to drive the three bodies back to the cemetery in Memphis, where the three bodies were buried. That is the story that Alfredo Shaw gave investigators after seeing news about the arrests. Now, that series of events doesn't jive at all with the timeline that everybody else gave. Remember, the Montgomery brothers' cousin, Nikita, spoke of Marcellos and Frederick being kidnapped out of her house. Chris Hines spoke of his car being used, not a stolen car. And why in the world would these guys drive the three victims all the way to Mississippi to kill them there and then drive the bodies back to Memphis? As it turns out, prosecutors did use Alfredo Shaw at the grand jury hearing to tell his story, and Tony Carruthers would later say that Alfredo Shaw's testimony at the grand jury hearing is what got him indicted. However, and here's the crazy part, Alfredo Shaw was later interviewed by various news media sources on recorded video, and he told the media that he had made the whole thing up, that he lied, that he had never even met Carruthers. So prosecutors decided, after seeing Alfredo Shaw on the news, that they would not use Alfredo Shaw at trial. He would not be called as a witness. But Tony Carruthers, now acting as his own lawyer, made the decision that he will call Alfredo Shaw to the stand because, in his mind, Shaw's fabricated story to the grand jury is what got him indicted in the first place. So remember, prosecutors did not call Alfredo Shaw to the stand. It was Tony Carruthers who would call Alfredo Shaw to the stand. The man who supporters of Tony Carruthers today have plastered all over the internet and social media saying that Alfredo Shaw is the reason that Tony Carruthers was found guilty and sentenced to death and will be executed. When prosecutors learned that Alfredo Shaw was going to testify, they let him know that if he told a different story than what he told the grand jury, that he would be charged with multiple counts of perjury. So, while Carruthers thought that Alfredo Shaw was going to say that he lied to the grand jury to get him indicted, that's not what happened. Alfredo Shaw decided to repeat his same ridiculous story at Carruthers' murder trial. If you ask me, the jury most likely ignored it anyway. But now, with Tony Carruthers' execution date approaching, supporters of Tony Carruthers are making a big deal out of this. And like I said, the narrative they want you to believe is that this man's ridiculous, made-up story is the main number one reason that will get Tony Carruthers executed by the state of Tennessee. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more of these death row and upcoming execution stories so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more death row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Thank you for watching. Take care and bye for now.